Welcome back. This week we'll be covering the Chicano movement. You'll be watching a documentary, particularly focusing on kids. The documentary that you watched last week also addressed the Chicano movement, looking at four kind of major periods and also four major movements, such as Corky Gonzalez, and with a culmination at the very end with the events in East Los Angeles, and hopefully you saw all that. So there's a lot to talk about the Chicano movement. But this week we're going to focus on Cesar Chavez because he's so pivotal to really giving birth to the Chicano movement. So we're going to look at a little bit of history, a little bit of myth creation that he did himself, and also going to focus on his religiosity. Faith played a very important role in the way the Chicano movement, and particularly the UFW, is shaped. This is going to be a fairly lengthy one, lengthy lecture, so bear with me. So these are the kind of objectives that we're going to address. Number one, look at his history and see how, like most people, our personal experiences shape our political views. We're going to address the religiosity and see how Cesar Chavez was able to utilize religion to benefit his movement. And lastly, look at really, as I said at the beginning, the birth of the Chicano movement. It's because of Cesar Chavez that a lot of Chicano activists get their start in his movement and then bridge over to more to other movements that happened during this period. Personally, I teach an entire course on this subject, just on the Chicano movement itself. So we're only kind of highlighting, a few pieces here and there. So we begin by looking at Cesar Chavez's past. It has his name, and his birthday is about to come up. But something about his past is that he is actually born into like a middle-class family. So a lot of times we think of Cesar Chavez as having a humble beginning, and there's some elements of that, but his family was kind of well off. You see Cesar right here as a young boy, kind of cute little boy, right? But his parents, they had a lot of businesses, or a few different businesses, such as a repair shop, a grocery store, a pool hall. So he wasn't dirt poor, but he wasn't rich either during this period. However, unlike when we think of bourgeois today, we think of people that are well off and just stay at home. Cesar Chavez, even though they did have means, he still helped around the house, right? He still had to do chores. They worked on the family farm, whatever it took, so you don't drop to the lower class. However, by the 1930s, the Great Depression hits his family, and they really begin to hurt. His father actually owes taxes on property, and there were actually programs to help him pay off those taxes, but they were never made aware. And a lot of people kind of claim that this was part of that kind of racist system where certain people benefited from it, but people of color did not. So that program was there to help him, and he was just never notified of it, particularly when he went to his bank. His bank could have told him, look, why don't you apply for this? And they never did, and actually took the property, and that kind of pushed Cesar Chavez's family into the lower class, and now they have to work. And one thing that they did was follow the fields. They had to move and start working in the agricultural business, picking different vegetables and fruit. So they moved to Oxnard, California. As he works out in the fields and they constantly have to move, Cesar Chavez doesn't have a very stable life because work in the fields is never stable. They always have to move around. It's just a reality of the job. But I believe he joins the Navy. He actually joins the Navy in 46. However, here you see a picture of him, right, in the Navy. He uses this to his advantage. He always made himself to be a war vet, and he never really was, because by 46 the war was over. But that's part of that myth of Cesar Chavez, that he used this to his advantage, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. Once he leaves the Navy, he moves to a neighborhood called Sal Si Puedes, which is in San Jose. So those of you that speak Spanish, you know this term, right? It means get out if you can. So it just kind of shows the type of places he's living. Really, it's kind of hardcore barrios. But within the barrio, he meets this man named Fred Ross, who's a community organizer. As I mentioned in the past, during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Mexican Americans are building coalitions with Anglo-Americans. So Fred Ross is the first person that sees something special in Cesar Chavez. And he asks him to join the organization, and he does. And he helps in many different ways. One thing that he helps do is organize the Mexican American community, and kind of help with voter registration and things like that. But the organization and Cesar Chavez are labeled as possible communists, particularly as you get into the late 40s and into the 50s. This becomes very problematic for people who are advocating for equality. They get quickly labeled possibly communists, and it's a label that's hard to shake off once you're called this. But Cesar Chavez, again, because he was a war vet, he's able to use that history of his to his advantage. He moves back to Oxnard, and in the 50s he begins to start his farm workers movement. He leaves the CSO, the Community Service Organization. I mentioned them earlier when they help with the Bracero program, and ANMA in that organization. So he leaves the CSO and really focuses on organizing farm workers. Part of it had to do because of his experience working as a farm worker, and farm workers didn't have many rights during this period. So by 1958, he forms the National Farm Workers Association, which is really the precursor to the UFW, the United Farm Workers. Now, the National Farm Workers Association is mostly Mexican and Mexican American. There is another union that is led by Filipinos, and these two organizations meet in the 1960s, kind of come together and help form the UFW. So Cesar Chavez kind of takes over, but this is a movement that has other people included in it too, such as Filipinos. Now, his battle to try to get farm workers some kind of recognition was really an uphill battle. Number one, the biggest obstacle he had was the Wagner Act that was passed in 1935. This was a piece of legislation passed by Roosevelt that allowed industrial workers to unionize and for companies to recognize them, to recognize their union for collective bargaining. And unfortunately, farm workers, along with domestic workers, those people who work at home, clean homes, those type of people, were excluded from union recognition. So Cesar Chavez was trying to create a union. However, it did not have federal support. Another thing that Cesar Chavez was fighting was the Bracero program. The Bracero program was a program that was established in the 1940s that was supposed to help during the war efforts because men were going out to fight. They needed cheap labor to come work in the fields. So the U.S. and the Mexican government worked together to create a program that allowed Mexican nationals to migrate to the United States and work. The program had many problems, but it definitely hurt the UFW because it was only supposed to be implemented for the war. And as you can see, it continued to 1964. World War II ended in 45. This program was so successful economically for the owners that it continued on to 1964. So it was hard for Cesar Chavez to form a union when it's competing with this cheap labor that the U.S. government recognizes. Another battle he had was commercial agriculture. If you go to places like California, San Joaquin Valley, that's outside of the major cities, you have these big agro businesses, basically, it's what they are, just big old kind of corporate agricultural industry over there with hundreds and hundreds of acres of fields. And most of them tend to be associated with the Republican Party. So this is another obstacle that Cesar Chavez needs to fight because the Republican Party is very anti-union at this time. And most of these, small towns, if you ever go up and down the San Joaquin Valley in California, you have small towns like Turlock and Merced and Fresno and Bakersfield. They're bigger places today, but back in the 1950s and 60s, they were all basically small towns that are controlled by commercial agriculture. They're the ones who bring in the money. They're the ones who help run the Senate or some of these people's campaigns. So they essentially control everything in these small towns. So it was really difficult to have the working class have a voice in some of these communities, and much less farm workers. Some of them, are at the bottom of society at this time, working in these fields. So Cesar Chavez, by 1965, becomes more successful in his movement, partly because the Bracero program ended in 64. He creates a battle with the McFarland Rose Farm, where they were able to get an increase in wages, but unfortunately they didn't get union recognition. So this is one of the few success stories. There's a lot of give and take between the UFW and farm growers, where there are certain benefits, but without union recognition, they can basically not follow them year after year. Understand that in agribusiness, workers are always seasonal, right? They start working, they pick lettuce. That only takes maybe a month or something like that, and then they move to a different field, somewhere else in the state, right? So they kind of follow the fields throughout California. So it's not a stable job like us working at Best Buy or those type of tasks. So this is a very difficult industry to unionize. The most kind of significant event is at Coachella. So most of you know Coachella because of that concert. But next time you're there, note that that's where the farm worker struggle really kind of took off. The growers didn't want to recognize the union, so all the workers in the field who were picking grapes decided to strike. And this strike lasts, I think, about 5 years. Now, that's a long time without work for many of these people. But it's something that needed to be done. So they walk out, and Cesar Chavez didn't just focus on organizing farm workers. Because the Wagner Act did not recognize farm workers, they can get away with boycotting. Other industries that were recognized by the Wagner Act could not boycott. So Cesar Chavez used the power of the media at this time to address the concerns that farm workers are going through and asking the public to stop buying grapes. And it had a major impact. Your local Anglo-American consumer would go into the stores and not buy the grapes unless they had maybe a union stamp or something like that. Reagan, who was governor of California at that time, Ronald Reagan, if you know who he is, he kind of made fun of the whole situation by buying grapes to support troops in Vietnam. So it was a bit of a slap in the face. That's why a lot of people, particularly Mexican Americans, hated Ronald Reagan, because he would play those type of childish games. But this movement, this great boycott, really started off this massive movement that was beyond Coachella and beyond California, but it became almost international. All right, I'll stop it there and I'll come back and address some of these other issues.